Thank you all so much for coming. I wanted to thank Mr. David French and Dean Erwin Chemerinsky for your time today. They're very busy, so we tried very hard to get them out here. This event is being telecasted, and there'll be a live stream online, so there will be a live audience as well. And I just want to first thank everyone else for coming. This is really, an initiative between students and the university to essentially, demonstrate that constructive conversations and democratic deliberation really are still the norm in society. Right now, politics is so toxic. We really see a lack of dialogue. We really see a lack of constructive engagement across political differences. And the goal is to show that these conversations can happen. It is possible for intellectuals, still given our toxic culture, to really engage and come to fruitful consensus points and come to a point of agreement. So I want to first introduce our first panelist, Mr. David French. He's a senior writer and editor at the National Review Institute. He has done a lot of work when it comes to sort of advocating for the Republican Party in the face of Trumpist thought. And he's done a lot of writings, especially in the National Review Institute, recently in The Atlantic, discussing how we can sort of counter the influence of President Trump in the Republican Party. And then we have our esteemed Dean, Erwin Chemerinsky. He's one of the preeminent legal scholars. He's also on Wikipedia. I looked today, and it said that you're the most cited legal scholar, or the second most cited, not the first, but the second, the second most cited. I guess that's still a good honor. He's done a lot of work in constitutional law, and he's currently the dean of the Berkeley Law School. And I want to thank Professor Stephen Hayward for bringing out Mr. David French, and I want to also thank the Chancellor and our two organizations that are sponsoring this event, Bridge USA, who I am one of the student leaders of, and we have the National Review Institute. Bridge USA is one of the organizations on campus. It was started 2 years ago. It essentially came outside of the Milo Yiannopoulos riots, if you all remember, that sort of really cast Berkeley into the limelight and really made free speech a central issue in college campuses. So this is one of the 25 chapters. I'm personally the CEO of the organization, and then we have some of our student leaders in the audience. And our goal is to partner with the university to make these events happen. So with that being said, I'm going to start a conversation essentially about how we engage politics and how we can figure out common consensus on certain issues. Democracy is sort of the real topic today. What is the state of democracy? Where's democracy headed now? Where are we headed? So the first question right off the bat is, what do you think is the state of democracy? Everyone talks about the doomsday is coming.
It might be, I'd have to say. Well, first, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I really it's a treat to share the stage with Dean Chemerinsky. And Dean, you have the distinction of being the person who came closest to anyone else in the United States of America to persuading me to vote for Donald Trump. Now, to give some background, I read an article you wrote in The Atlantic about the future of a progressive Supreme Court. And I was like, no. But then the more I thought about it, I thought, no, I still can't vote for Donald Trump. So this is a real treat. And so thank you very much for having me. I would say when I think of the state of democracy, I tend to think more of what is the state of our constitutional republic. Because I think when you use the word democracy, that often means majoritarianism. And some parts of our Constitution are very much dedicated to majoritarianism, and some are intentionally counter-majoritarian. And are these parts functioning the way they should? And I would say no, they're not. Structurally, we have a significant problem in that the most powerful branch of government, people say 3 co-equal branches. They're not 3 co-equal branches. The legislature is designed to be more potent than the presidency and the Supreme Court. And it has become the least potent. So you think about the House of Representatives as sort of the most democratic element of our constitutional structure, and yet it is the weakest in many ways. It is the weakest half of the weakest branch of government, and that is not what was intended. So that's a tremendous problem. Then the other thing is, I think that's a real issue, is we are losing a culture of respect for civil liberties, a culture of respect for free speech, even if the law is solid. And so what I mean by that is we're beginning to implement, a lot of people don't realize that the First Amendment case law right now protects free speech to a degree almost unprecedented in American history. And yet people often do not feel free to speak, even though they're more free from government interference than they've ever been, arguably. There is a sense of social sanction and social consequences and economic consequences and career consequences if you speak up that I think is really damaging people's perception that our republic is healthy. And then, we have the concept of negative polarization. So negative polarization essentially means that if I'm a Republican not because I love Republican ideas, but because I really don't like Democrats. And if I'm a Democrat not because I like Democratic ideals, but because I really don't like Republicans. And this is a bipartisan problem. So if you look at some Pew data, they would say that 82% of Republicans either have a very unfavorable or an unfavorable view of Democrats, just Democrats in general. It's not always been the case that it's that unfavorable. Democrats are more tolerant. They have 78% of them have an unfavorable or very unfavorable view of Republicans. And I would say that is not a sustainable way to build and to continue a healthy constitutional republic. But other than that, everything's fine.
That's rather somber, Dean.
Let me also begin by saying what an honor and pleasure it is to be here and how wonderful to share the stage with you. I'm going to answer your question directly. I don't believe our constitutional republic is in danger. The Constitution has lasted since 1787. There's no reason to believe that it's not going to continue to last in the future. I certainly believe that Donald Trump is a threat to many things about our social fabric, but I don't think he's a threat to the Constitution itself. Elections were held all over the country a week ago yesterday. People were elected, people were defeated. Some elections are unresolved because the ballots are still being counted, but that's what it should be in a democracy. Now, when you ask the question, what's the state of our democracy, I'm then also led to ask, well, compared to what? Compared to an autocratic society, our democracy is alive and well. On the other hand, we have in the White House someone who lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. In fact, twice in the last 16 years, or 2 out of the last 3 presidents, we had somebody who lost the popular vote becoming president. The United States is the only country in the world that considers itself a democracy where the person who loses the popular vote can be president. We should be very concerned about that in terms of our democracy. Because of partisan gerrymandering, in terms of congressional districts, in terms of state legislative districts, in terms of city council districts, often it's not voters choosing their elected officials, but elected officials choosing their voters. And I think this is a real threat to our democratic system. In terms of freedom of speech, and I know we're going to talk about that more, there's a greater commitment to freedom of speech on the part of the Supreme Court than at any point in history. I think we would agree with that. In terms of social pressures to not speak, that's nothing new. That's existed throughout American history. And I don't know that it's worse today than it's been before. I will agree with you that I think our society is more polarized than at any time that it's been since, not Reconstruction, since the Civil War. And I worry very much what's the path forward beyond that polarization. I think that polarization is deeply destructive of our social fabric, and I don't think anyone's come up with an idea for how to bring us together.
So David mentioned, there's a cultural attack on the Constitution, I would say, or a cultural attack on the ideals. For example, social pressures, as you mentioned, or in the form of free speech, there's a real cultural pressure. Would you say that that's a risk, or maybe is that sort of the way you characterize the argument?
So I think there's not a cultural threat to the Constitution. It's a cultural threat to the value of free speech.
Right.
So, for example, here's what I mean.
Sure.
So I'm in a Sunday school class a couple of weeks ago right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And Nashville, Tennessee, for those who aren't really familiar with it all that much, isn't just the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, it's the Jerusalem of the Bible Belt. I mean, it is a core that's the head of the Southern Baptist Convention is there, Christian publishing industry, Christian music industry. And a guy said, he works for a major, a multinational corporation that has offices in Nashville, and he said, I don't feel like I can express my point of view in the same way that my colleagues can without risking my job and without risking my future. And there is a widespread sense that particularly if someone is culturally conservative or religious, traditionally religious, that in many parts and sectors of the American economy, there is a risk to your career, a risk to your livelihood, even if you are civil, even if you have never discriminated against anybody in the corporation, that the existence of your point of view, that your point of view is known, is a problem. And I think that is something that is a pervasive feeling across the United States of America, and it's something that is embittering an awful lot of Americans right now. And I think it's something that our culture has to get a grip on.
So one of the things that Erwin said was, and then I'll let you respond, this has existed though. This has been a part of American history. Well, do you think it's at a peak right now?
I don't know that it's a peak, but it's worse than it was in recent years.
Okay.
So, a lot of times we always suffer, people suffer from recency bias.
Right.
Maybe it's recency bias that makes me think that LeBron James is the greatest of all time. I think he actually is, but we always bias. It's always worse now. It's always, better now. Whatever superlative you want to use, we have this recency bias. However, it is absolutely the case. That a person interacting in corporate America, particularly progressive-dominated corporate America, if they have a particular point of view on sex and marriage, on particular hot-button cultural issues, they are at risk. And that is something that I think is a real problem. And it's something that is feeding negative polarization, because it should not be the case that a person, so long as they're not discriminating, they're being respectful in the workplace, that the mere existence that you have a particular point of view, the mere knowledge that you have a particular point of view, will inhibit your career, or perhaps destroy your livelihood. And I think that is a real problem.
I'm going to disagree. I do want to draw a distinction between freedom of speech as a constitutional matter and freedom of speech in terms of social interactions, because there's a very important distinction there. The First Amendment applies to the government. The First Amendment doesn't apply to private institutions. When I taught at Duke Law School, if I had criticized the president of the university, and he would, I guess say, if I were again to criticize the president of the university, and he would have ordered me fired, I couldn't have sued him or the university for violating my First Amendment rights. The Constitution doesn't apply to a private institution like Duke. But here, if I were to give a speech critical of Janet Napolitano, and she would order me fired, I could sue. In fact, you can be my witnesses. I would sue, because this is a state institution. The First Amendment applies. And the point that I think we agree to is we have a Supreme Court more committed to protecting free speech than at any time in American history. Now, if you look back through American history, you find not only that the Supreme Court wasn't being protective of speech, but there was also enormous social pressures with regard to speech. Think of the McCarthy era from the late 1940s through the 1950s. Merely being suspected of being a communist was enough for somebody to lose a job, sometimes even to lose liberty. And the Supreme Court didn't stand up to those pressures. We're not experiencing anything like that now. You can go back in American history. During World War I, Congress passed statutes that made it a crime to criticize the draft of the war effort. A man went to prison for 20 years for circulating a leaflet saying, "Do not submit to intimidation. The draft is unconstitutional." Now, not a single piece of evidence existed that his leaflet had the slightest effect, but the Supreme Court upheld the conviction and the sentence. That was tremendously chilling of speech. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln ordered the jailing of people who criticized the way the North was fighting the Civil War, and no court stood up for them. Talk about chilling the speech. I could give so many more examples. So instead, what we're talking about now, the question is, Do conservatives have reason to fear that if they speak up and express their conservative views, they'll lose their jobs, that they'll be socially ostracized? I think there is very little evidence to support that. I think we're at a point in time where everyone wants to portray themselves as the victims. I see this all the time in my law school. Every group wants to tell me why they're the victims. And I think conservatives want to tell us they're the victims. Gosh, we have a conservative president. Still at this moment, we have both houses of Congress controlled by the Republican Party. We have a conservative majority in the Supreme Court for some time to come. Maybe that's why I can't feel so sympathetic with conservatives being the victims in our society. The reality is there are a few high-profile incidents of individuals who've been fired for saying offensive things in the workplace, like the Google incident. But I sure don't see many incidents of people losing their jobs or being expelled from school or losing benefits for expressing conservative views. I agree we're deeply polarized as a society. That's obvious. But I don't think that conservatives are the victims at this point in time.
I'm sure you have one.
Yeah, so we're in this really interesting environment where you're exactly right. Both sides feel aggrieved. Conservatives, if you talk to a conservative audience, are going to say, yeah, we've got the government, but we don't have the culture. And the culture is more powerful than politics. And it's a very famous statement in conservative circles that politics is downstream from culture. And so an awful lot of really smart conservatives look at politics and they say politics as an influencer of the overall course of a nation. The culture of a nation, the ethos of a nation is lower in importance and priority than the arts, for example, lower in importance and priority than the marketplace, for example. And so what you have is a dynamic right now where conservatives will say, yeah, we have politics, we don't have the more important thing. And then a lot of folks on the left will go, how on earth can you put yourself in any kind of position where you feel like you're losing anything when, at least until 2018, the Republican Party was at a 100-year high in political power and influence. 100-year high. But a lot of this is the product of the polarization that we're talking about. Each side sort of has its spheres that it has been more successful at. And what ends up happening is that people who are, those who are, for lack of a better term, sort of strangers in a strange land, the people who enter into the core sphere of the other side often feel, and often for very, very good reasons, quite isolated, under siege. And it's you can talk to progressives who would say the same thing in different contexts in this country as well. And so that's a product of negative polarization. And one thing that I would say is it has reached such a critical mass, especially in the academy, especially in, for example, really critical areas like Silicon Valley, that you would say, well, I've never censored any GOP employee that I have. And then you look around and go, but I don't have any of those colleagues at all. You know, you looked at, there was this survey of Silicon Valley giving, and it was extraordinary political giving. 98.5%, 99% going to one side. And what we've done is we've created monocultures within this country that are where we're beginning to wall out the other side. And that is something that's deeply corrosive to the social fabric. And I'm not saying, oh, look at the victims, look at the victims. I'm saying there is a reality of a walling off and a cocooning in this country that is corrosive. And one of the aspects of the cocooning and walling off is that within those communities that are cocooned, you will see an increasing amount of intolerance and a decreasing amount of openness, or even desire or interest in being open to people with opposing points of view.
So I want to bring this conversation to the college campuses quickly, and it's still pertinent. There's often the argument is made that there's a real cultural pressure against conservatives, and the most recent example, actually a high-profile case, was just at Berkeley. I think last week it was that one of the student senators spoke against transgender rights on campus, or said that it doesn't necessarily align with a religion, and so there was massive protests and uprising against that amongst the student body. Do you think that there's a cultural pressure against conservatives on college campuses?
Well, not at Hillsdale. But yeah, absolutely. Now, there are times when I will freely admit that there have been student groups, Republican student groups, conservative student groups, who sort of have intentionally trolled. Like they'll intentionally whip up a fervor and then go, "Oh, look at all this intolerance." I'm not interested in those kinds of incidents. But I think it's hard to look at the state of discourse on college campuses and say that. Now, I do actually think it's better in 2018, 2019 so far than it has been in some previous years. But, when we've had acts of violence, we've had acts of, attempted hecklers' vetoes, you have people who will contact me, and because I write about free speech on college campuses, they will talk about incidents that never make the news, that are extraordinarily vicious acts directed against people who especially disagree on these sexual revolution issues, especially on those issues. So to say that discourse is healthy on college campuses, I think is just flat out wrong. And then I would say it's a natural byproduct of an ideological monoculture. It is very hard it is more difficult to be tolerant when you are rarely, if ever, exposed to thoughtful perspectives from the other side, and I have often come to believe that these people, rather than being people of goodwill, are inherently malicious or bigoted in some way.
Let me start with our agreement. I believe that college campuses should be a place where all ideas and views are expressed, all are tolerated, all are respected. Disagree, though, with a lot of other things that you say. To start with, I'm a liberal, and if I could find a bottle with a genie and I could trade and get a liberal majority on the Supreme Court, a liberal president, liberal control of Congress, I would gladly give up the culture in order to be able to have that.
Deal.
Oh, if only we had that kind of a choice to make. In terms of Silicon Valley or any other workplace, I challenge you to show me that there's discrimination based on ideology going and hiring, or other than a rare instance, somebody's getting fired on account of ideology. Now, why do people have particular ideologies? It's interesting, many studies have shown the more educated people become, the more liberal they become. And so people who have less than a high school degree are much more likely to be politically conservative. On the other end, those who have post-bachelor's degrees are much more likely to be liberal. And so you need to take that into account when you talk about liberalism in a place like Silicon Valley or liberalism within universities. I've been a professor now for 39 years. This is the 5th university where I've had a full-time appointment. I teach large classes. I don't see the chilling of the conservative viewpoint that you do. I don't see a crisis of free speech on college campuses. I walk across this campus many times a week. There's always free speech activities going on in Sproul Plaza. There's always posters all over campus for speakers, liberals and conservatives. And that's true of campus across the country. Now, I wrote a book titled Free Speech on Campus, so people write me all the time with incidents too. But they're the atypical incidents. Now, it's true that in any environment, there can be criticism if you say things that others don't like. So if somebody comes before a group and expresses a view that the group doesn't like, they have free speech rights to say that we don't accept that message. So if somebody wants to say that same-sex marriage is morally wrong, they have the First Amendment right to say it. But so do people have the First Amendment right to say, we disagree with you, and we think that your position is bigoted. And that's free speech too. It can't be that free speech is only to express a conservative viewpoint, and those who want to criticize the conservative viewpoint are doing something wrong. So I don't find the silencing the conservative viewpoint. I don't see it in my classes. I don't see it on this campus. I don't see it at campuses across the country as a general matter.
So we came across this point of, is political power more important or is cultural power more important? And I think that's a good transition to the midterms. Do you think, first, why do you think that, political power is more important than cultural power? Do you think that if the laws are enacted but society is necessarily the majority against those laws. Do you think those laws have much force or impact? Is there a reason why you think political power is more important? Dean?
What the Supreme Court does affects all of us, often the most important and intimate aspects of our lives. I think we now have 5 justices who are going to effectively or explicitly overrule Roe versus Wade. And it is going to have a devastating effect, especially on poor women in this country, devastating effect in terms of their lives, their families, their careers. We're going to have a Supreme Court, I think, that's going to very much narrow the protections for gays and lesbians in this country. And it's going to have a devastating effect on their lives. And I can go through example of what I think it's going to mean that we now have 5 conservatives on the court. And here it's not about abstractions. So what it's going to mean for people's lives. I look at what Donald Trump has meant for this country. I look at the environment. You have a president who denies the problem of climate change, who might, by pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, be giving up the only chance we have to literally save the planet. I'll take saving the planet over cultural power.
So you were ready to give up all of that?
Oh, because see what would happen is when you have the cultural power, left and right moves, right? And the culture moves left and right. The culture determines what is the left edge and what is the right edge. And so if conservatives had the cultural power, what would be a progressive Supreme Court would be different. And what would be a conservative Supreme Court would be different. So what happens is when you have immense cultural power, you change the entire frame of reference. So for example, let's take the abortion debate. As a pro-life American, what I want is 0 abortions. That's what I want. I do not want any abortions in the United States of America. And now, there are a couple of ways. I don't think that there's any prospect reasonable, even if Roe v. Wade is overturned, that you would reach 0 abortions in the United States of America without immense cultural change. Immense cultural change. Because California would immediately protect the right to abortion. A host of blue states would. Red states would have varying legal regimes. But abortion would still be legal in the United States at scale. But if there was an immense cultural change regarding abortion, you could reduce abortion far more dramatically, even than by eliminating Roe v. Wade. That's the power of culture. And so one of the things that we often forget is that culture sets where the boundaries of political debate are. Culture sets what are acceptable ideas to even begin to offer. That puts there's this phrase called the Overton window. The Overton window being sort of the window of acceptable debate on various issues. And where the Overton window moves is where the politics moves in many ways. So for example, one thing that has been outside the Overton window, by and large, and hopefully will remain outside the Overton window, is out and out mainstream expressed white supremacy. Like that is something that both political parties reject. And that is a point of view that is completely outside of the mainstream, and that's the power of culture. And so that's when I say that culture is more powerful. What culture does is it shifts left and right. If you look at the Clinton political positions, Bill Clinton political positions, just to look at the power of culture. Bill Clinton in the 1990s passed a series of legislative packages that could not make it through an all-Republican legislature with a Republican president now. You could never pass a Defense of Marriage Act, setting Obergefell. You couldn't now because of Obergefell, but you couldn't pass a Defense of Marriage Act. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which passed with overwhelming majorities, would not be passed. The elements of the Clinton crime bill would be an anathema now. Like you could go down the list in the Clinton administration and you would say, those things are not politically possible anymore. Why are they not? Because the culture shifted radically.
So a lot of those, I want to...
Can I just say, I think we're drawing a false distinction. Because the reality is culture and politics are inherently integrated. And I'm not sure we gain anything by saying which is more important than the other. Take marriage equality. It wouldn't have happened if not for the legal system. It was the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in 2003 that was the first state to find a constitutional right to same-sex marriage under the state constitution. And then other states began to do so. And then slowly this became something that changed public attitudes. And within 12 years, there's right to same-sex marriage in all states. Right now, a significant majority of the population and 85% of voters under age 35 favor same-sex marriage. So I worry that by trying to separate culture and politics, we're doing something that isn't very useful and is actually a false distinction.
So we talked about the Supreme Court, and I think that this sort of is a good segue from the distinction between culture and power and whether or not that should exist. Should the court, be influenced by these cultural shifts? Isn't the court an independent institution, or do you think it's lost its impartiality in politics?
I think we've got to take out the word, be careful with the word impartiality as to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not political in some senses that we use the word. It's not elected. It doesn't face election by the voters at any point in time. No one can lobby the Supreme Court. You can lobby your city council member. You can lobby a state legislator. You can lobby a member of Congress. You can't lobby the Supreme Court. So far as we know, Supreme Court justices never trade votes in the way legislators will trade votes. So in that sense, it's not a political institution. But it has always been through American history, and always will be, that the values of the justices determine how they decide cases. The language of the Constitution is so ambiguous. What's cruel and unusual punishment? What's due process of law? Also, no right in the Constitution is absolute. Inevitably, it's about balancing competing interests. And that's a product of who's on the court. That's been true from the first days of American history. Marbury versus Madison was a function of the views of John Marshall. In the 1890s and 1930s, a very conservative court struck down 200 federal, state, and local laws protecting employees and consumers because of the ideology of the justices. The Warren Court expanded civil rights and civil liberties because of the ideology of the justices. So I don't think that the court is more or less impartial today than it's been. It's just that ideologically, we have the most conservative court now we've had since the mid-1930s.
People of my average intelligence would ask, so it's never been a nonpartisan institution. It's not right to talk about it as a nonpartisan institution.
Well, what do you mean by nonpartisan?
Well, I would say that, in the mainstream, when we talk about the Supreme Court, we assume that it cannot be influenced. It's just not influenced by those cultural forces. Kavanaugh's nomination, everything that came with Kavanaugh's nomination, that has no effect on the decisions of the court.
The Supreme Court justices are human beings that live in society. So inevitably, they're going to be influenced by the society that they live in. And I don't think the court is partisan in a Democrat or Republican sense. I don't think it's partisan in the sense of blatant party politics. I do think, though, that the justices have a great deal of discretion in how they exercise it as a result of the views and the life experience of those who are on the court. I'll give you an example. Bush versus Gore in December of 2000. I remember on Friday night, and I can tell you that it was December 8th, 2000, the Florida Supreme Court said that all the uncounted votes in Florida should be counted. Does that sound familiar today? Does that sound like deja vu all over again? And I remember I went on a television program, Revere Live, on CNBC, and said, everyone who I know who voted for Al Gore takes the view that the Florida Supreme Court was right and all the votes should be counted. And everyone I know who voted for George W. Bush says that there should be an end to the counting of the votes. And I said, why believe that the Supreme Court justices are going to see it any differently than that? And they didn't. The 5 most conservative justices all came down on the Bush side and said, end the counting of the votes. The 4 liberal justices came down on the side of the Florida Supreme Court and said, count all the votes. But I don't think it's that the 5 conservative justices were saying, we want a Republican president, and the 4 more liberal just say, we want a Democratic president. I think we look at things through our own experiences. We look at things through the lens we start with. And the justices are no different than that either. They can aspire to try to decide cases to their best views of the Constitution, but they're still human beings. They still live in a society.
Well, nobody disputes that every judge has a judicial philosophy. Judges have judicial philosophies. The question is, what is your philosophy? What will that philosophy mean in considering the outcomes of cases? What's the legitimacy of that philosophy versus, and what are the dangers of that philosophy? What are the virtues of that philosophy? One of the reasons why I believe it is, I prefer to see justices who take a position that their job is to try to determine the original public meaning of the Constitution, of the statutes that they interpret. It's because I believe that that is putting the justices where they are intended to be within a constitutional structure. And that when they are outside of that particular role, it distorts the entire structure of our federal government. And it actually creates some of the very institutional and structural problems that we've been talking about now. For example, where the House of Representatives, one half of what is supposed to be the most powerful branch of government, is now the least consequential. How inconsequential is the House of Representatives? You talk to, if you put a Republican right now on a polygraph machine, and you ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how upset are you about losing the House, and how happy are you about expanding the lead in the Senate? The losing the House, like, they could say, and they would say, I'm actually thrilled with expanding the Senate and don't care that much about the House. And they would pass that polygraph with flying colors, because the energy of the Republican Party right now is not directed towards legislation. It's not. I hate to say that. I think there's some really good legislative reforms that could be passed, but it's just not. The executive branch has so much power right now, so much power. But think about this. Democrats actually were quite optimistic about their political power in the U.S. going into the 2016 election, even though they had been slaughtered up and down state and congressional races, had lost a net of about 1,000 seats in state legislatures because they had the presidency. And so that distortion of power, I think, is a real problem. And so one of the things about the philosophy of applying the original public meaning is you're ratcheting the court back into its intended position, and that's where our system best functions.
May I respond to that?
Go ahead.
I think that it's impossible to follow the original public meaning as a way of interpreting the Constitution, and no justices ever really do it. Let me try to explain that a little bit. The Constitution is written in very broad language. As I mentioned, what's cruel and unusual punishment? What's freedom of speech? We don't know what the original public meaning was. So many people participated in the drafting and ratification of the Constitution. It's a myth to say there was some intent. And even if somehow we could know it, it's so irrelevant for our modern world. Take the issues the Supreme Court has to deal with. Do corporations have the right to spend unlimited amounts of money in election campaigns to get candidates elected or defeated? That was the issue in Citizens United for Federal Election Commission. I challenge anyone to find an original public meaning in 1791 about that, because corporations didn't exist then as they exist today, and election spending didn't exist then as it exists today. In fact, if we were trying to follow the original public meaning, it would lead to such repugnant results we wouldn't want to do so. I'll give you an example. Article 2 of the Constitution refers to the president and the vice president with the pronoun he. It's clear that the framers intended that the president, vice president, would be male. Does that mean that it's unconstitutional to elect a woman as president or vice president until the Constitution is amended? Or another example. The same Congress that voted to ratify the 14th Amendment also voted to segregate the District of Columbia public schools. Does that then mean that Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided? Because you can't reconcile with the original public meaning as adopted by Congress at the time of the 14th Amendment. Besides all that, there's strong evidence that the framers of the Constitution didn't want their views to be controlling. In fact, James Madison took the only notes we know of the Constitutional Convention, and he instructed that they not be published until after his death, which was in the 1840s. That if you really want to follow the framers' intent, the framers' intent was that their views not be followed. But beyond all of that, those justices who tell us that they're following the original public meaning really aren't doing so. I'll give you an example. Affirmative action. I don't think that we can ever really know framers' intent, but it's clear that the same Congress that ratified the 14th Amendment also adopted a lot of programs that we know of today as affirmative action, things like the Freedmen Bureau. And so you'd think that the conservative justices who want to follow original public meaning would say affirmative action is constitutional. And yet, the foremost opponents of affirmative action have been Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, and you never see a word in their opinions about public meaning. Where there was a terrible Supreme Court case 5 years ago, Shelby County versus Holder, that struck down provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this is a law that had been renewed by Congress unanimously in the Senate with only 33 no votes in the House, signed by President George W. Bush. The Supreme Court 5-4 found it unconstitutional because it violated the principle of equal state sovereignty, that Congress had to treat all states the same. I challenge anyone to find that in the Constitution or in the original public meaning. In fact, again, the Congress that ratified the 14th Amendment created military rule over the South in Reconstruction. So they didn't believe that Congress had to treat all states the same. The reality is conservatives invoke original public meaning when it gets to the results they like and completely ignore it when it doesn't get to the results they like.
That's completely false. The fact that the Constitution is susceptible to debate about the original public meaning is not the same thing as saying there is no original public meaning. And the idea that, for example, if you talk to Antonin Scalia about, say, what would he prefer if he was going to draft the Constitution, what would his, from the ground up, what would his preferred stance be, say, on various due process issues regarding the rights of criminal suspects? Scalia himself as a man might be quite the law and order hawk when in fact when he was deciding a number of cases that dealt with the rights of criminal defendants, he sided with liberal justices time and again because he felt that this is what the meaning of the Constitution dictated. Now, one of the things that I think is important to realize is, and Dean has done a very able job of misdirecting just a tad. No one would argue, for example, that the original public meaning and the use of the male pronoun in describing people who are going to be president and vice president, that was meant to be a mandatory provision of the Constitution. That kind of thing is very easy to discern. Now, there are things that are more difficult to discern that require judgment, such as what is the freedom of speech. And the interesting thing is there's not a whole lot of contemporaneous records about what the freedom of speech is in the First Amendment. It's one of the reasons why there's been so much contention around that. But one of the problems that we have is when you say, I'm going to abandon a notion of trying to figure out what these words were intended to mean when they were passed, when you abandon that, what you then have is essentially a document that becomes extraordinarily malleable, just extraordinarily malleable and subject to multiple meanings depending on the desires of the justice almost entirely. And so one of the things that the Dean's article, how he almost persuaded me to vote for Trump when he was talking about what a progressive Supreme Court would do, he was talking about a progressive Supreme Court, as I recall the article, that would create some positive rights, that would create, in much the way some state Supreme Courts have stepped in and created what are called positive rights. You have a right to a very particular kind of education, for example. And that is a situation where what you have is the Supreme Court becoming, in a very real way, a super legislative body. And that's a problem for our constitutional structure.
Can I just ask one follow-up question? Is there a way that we can change the nomination process to solve a lot of these issues?
Yes. If I could just respond before that. Let's take Antonin Scalia as an example, because it's one that you pick. Mm-hmm. He believes that the government should be able to give unlimited amounts of money to parochial schools. He believes that people who own businesses should be able to discriminate against same-sex couples on account of their religion, or refuse to write contraceptive coverage for women on account of the business owner's religious beliefs. He believes that there should be no constitutional right to abortion. He believes that affirmative action shouldn't be allowed, and so on. His views are remarkably like those of the Republican platform. Now, maybe you can believe that the framers in 1776, 1787 when the Constitution was drafted, or 1867 when the 14th was adopted, have the same views as the Republican platform today. I don't think so. I think he's simply reading his values into the Constitution, and they're coming out that way as a Supreme Court justice. I'm not saying that it's Republicans who do this and Democrats don't. I'm saying it's the nature of a document written by the Constitution in such open-ended language that inevitably how the decisions come out is a product of who's there. Their life experiences, their ideology and views. It's true for Democrats, it's true for Republicans. Why did the Republicans fight so hard to get Brett Kavanaugh confirmed? Why did the Republican senators ignore the compelling testimony of Christine Blasey Ford? Because they wanted that conservative justice on the court before the November election. And they wanted to make sure that they had the conservative majority because they know how much it means to have 5 conservative justices on the court. There is no such thing as value-neutral constitutional interpretation, which is the transition to your question. I do think the nomination process has become unduly toxic. And so I have a proposal, and maybe here we can find common ground.
I'm skeptical.
I think that the next president, Democrat or Republican, should say, I want to get past the bitter confirmation fights, so I'm going to create a judicial nomination commission. If it's a Republican president, 60% of the members will be Republican. If it's a Democratic president, 60% will be Democrat. And I want you to send me 3 names that 75% of you agree to. 3 people who you think would be superb Supreme Court justices. And I promise to either pick from your name or ask for additional names. I think that would tremendously diffuse the ugliness of the confirmation process. And any president could do it. And wouldn't it be nice if both Democrats and Republicans would say, this would be a really good change? Will you agree?
No, no.
I tried.
Yeah, and Brett Kavanaugh, ironically enough, would have been a guy that a commission like that would have selected.
We can debate that.
Yeah, I mean, Elena Kagan invited him to teach at Harvard Law School. Before the Christine Blasey Ford allegation, he had a lot of people who respected him on the left side of the aisle were pleased by his nomination, particularly compared to Amy Coney Barrett as an alternative. And in fact, when he was actually selected, one of the sounds you heard was a thundering sigh of disappointment from a large part of the Republican coalition. They did not want a Brett Kavanaugh.
Why not my proposal, though? Because I would make the same for Republican or Democratic president. We would agree in advance to do this.
Do you have a specific response to the commission and the creation of the commission? We're sending this tape to the White House, by the way. So
yeah.
It's going to be implemented.
So 75% of a...
Right. A Republican can make it a 20-member commission. The Republicans get, if Trump wins re-election or some Republican in 2020, the Republican gets to pick 60% of the members of it. And if it's Democrat, 60%. And just send me a name. In that way, it would be really a merit selection and say, I want somebody who's 75% of you, liberals and
If you have a lot of experience with the legal establishment in this country, the idea that an elite commission selecting a person is a merit-based process is hilarious. The legal elite of this country is in present company accepted, but the legal elite in this country is a pretty singularly unimpressive collection of individuals in my experience. And the idea that I'm going to take a constitutional process and I'm going to delegate that constitutional process to an unelected board of legal scholars, when I think legal scholarship and the community of legal scholars in the United States is frankly pretty low rent, both as a matter of character and as a matter of intellectual quality. No way.
I'm going to ignore the ad hominem argument on my profession. It's not going to get us any place.
I'm a lawyer too.
But what I do want to focus on is, what if I let the National Review pick the Republican group and the ACLU pick the Democratic group and still did it? Because to me, the key isn't how do you pick the people from the commission. The idea is trying to get a process to generate names that would be focusing on merit and that would have some bipartisan support to start with. And so we can certainly, between us, come up with a way of choosing the members of the commission that we're happy with.
This is a classic law school exercise. He's asking me a hypothetical that could never, ever happen in a million years.
I disagree. Jimmy Carter, when he was president...
But National Review was never going to pick him.
Well, Jimmy Carter, when he was president, created merit selection commissions for Federal Court of Appeals judgeships. He tried to do it for federal district court judgeships, but the senators wouldn't give up the prerogative. And they were incredibly successful in generating people who turned out to be terrific judges, also the most diverse group of judges to that point in American history. Prior to Jimmy Carter's presidency, there had only been 2 women serving as Federal Court of Appeals judges. Because of his merit selection plan, 9 women were picked in his presidency for that. He never had a vacancy to fill on the Supreme Court. But you asked me what would be a mechanism to reform the nomination process, and I think I already outlined one for you.
And before we go to Q&A, I just want to ask: Do you think there's an alternative to the president picking the nominee? Can we agree on that, or do you think that the president is the perfect?
The constitutional process of a president picking and a Senate advising and consenting, that process is not the problem. Okay. That is something that we've been doing for a very long time in this country. The problem that we have is what you have seen is the consequence of the negative polarization, the power of the toxic culture. I'm going to go back to that. We have you have a process that has existed for a very long time that is now existing in a different American culture. And when it exists in that different American culture, it has the natural consequence of that, because of the negative polarization, is that you're going to see the kind of combat that we have seen. There is not a way out of that in the short term. There just isn't. You would have to amend the Constitution to change the process, and if you ever had the amount of consensus that you needed to amend the Constitution to change the process, the problem would already have been solved, because the American national community would be fundamentally different. It would be a fundamentally different and more united place.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think that the way we're going to do this is we have Q&A. If the audience has questions, we have a microphone. But because it's 2 to 3:30, a lot of students aren't here. But we have a lot of student questions that were sent to us because we're on a campus. So it would be nice to also hear from students. So I'm going to ask one student question. But do we have questions from the audience first? Patrick. You pick. I'm not going to pick. It's on you.
My name's Diane Baker, and I'm a community member, and I'm an attorney. And nothing's ever upset me quite so much as the Congress blocking Obama from nominating the Supreme Court justice. What do you have to say about that?
Which one of us? Okay. So there's a presidential appointment and a Senate role in advising and consenting. One of the interesting things about that is that everyone involved in the process won their elections. And Obama won a presidential election, and McConnell and the Senate majority won all of their elections. And there was, in my view, the Senate exercised its advise and consent function and refused to consent. And there's nothing out of bounds from the constitutional process. That was the constitutional process. And one of the things I find difficult to deal with in this debate is I just flat out do not believe that if in the last 9 months of, say, George W. Bush's presidency, if Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to step down, that a Democratic majority Senate would have voted on, much less confirmed, anybody that George W. Bush had sent forward. And that's the consequence of elections.
Let's keep these responses short, by the way, so we can get
24 times in American history prior to 2016, there was a vacancy on the Supreme Court in the last year of a presidential term. In 21 of 24, the Senate confirmed. In 3 instances, the Senate denied confirmation. This is the only instance in history where a Senate had ever said, no hearings, no vote. And no one has raised the slightest question about Merrick Garland's qualifications. It was entirely power politics. And talk about increasing the toxicity and polarization. I think now from the foreseeable future, whenever a president and the majority of the Senate are of different political parties, certainly during the last 2 years, and maybe through the whole presidency, it's not going to be possible to get somebody confirmed. I think the Republicans have set a terrible precedent for the future.
Hi, thank you. So it seems like the general theme of the discussion is kind of the polarization of our politics. And it seems to me that there's kind of 2 more or less unique factors for the current time, which is one, that the split is more or less even, or is pretty even, in the United States between who supports those parties. And second, that the split is fairly geographical. So I'm wondering what you think the role of embracing our federal system could be in dealing with that issue, and if that's something that you support or what the problems are with that.
Oh, I think that if we want to turn down the temperature of American politics, we're going to have to embrace more federalism. The problem that we have right now is, citizens of California. Ted Cruz has too much power over the lives of the citizens of California. Dianne Feinstein has too much power over the lives of the citizens of Texas. And so what you end up having is an electoral dynamic where Nancy Pelosi is the issue in a congressional race in Alabama, where Mitch McConnell is the main issue in, say, Senate races in Washington or Oregon, because this is something that as a conservative would be heresy, but hold with me for a second. Part of me actually wanted to see California pass single payer. Here's why. It would have revived in a very dramatic way the notion of our states as laboratories of democracy. To have single payer happen, because just the financial reality of it, California would have had to have gotten a series of exemptions and waivers and special considerations from the United States government to kind of detach it from the rest of the welfare state, which would have then allowed multiple other states with other points of view to petition the federal government and to seek from the federal government a way to detach themselves and create their own systems. And I think it could have really revived federalism in this country. But I think we have a fundamental structural problem in that we are living lives that are increasingly customized. So one of the ways that Google is so huge and powerful is it provides a very customized experience for the user. One of the reasons why Amazon is so huge and powerful, it provides a customized user experience. We're living lives that in many of our other areas are very customized. And then we're fighting over a government that is increasingly centralized. And especially when we have very different cultures in this country, very different cultures concentrated in specific geographic regions. And that is a recipe for further conflict and further division.
I think it's so much more complicated than that. Look at right now the races that haven't yet been decided. Look at how close the races are for governor and senator in Florida, or for governor in Georgia, or just look at some of the races for Congress here in California. As of a little bit ago this morning, in the 45th Congressional District, Katie Porter, my former colleague at UCI Law School, is 200 votes ahead of Mimi Walters. So it's not just the difference between red states and blue states. We are just so closely divided in so many ways of society. Then I think the interesting question, and it's one really that isn't in my competence as a law professor, of how did this come to be? I don't know we'll be able to solve it unless we come up with better analysis of why. Some of it is how the political parties have become much more ideologically defined. Used to be that because of Southern Democrats, there was a real conservative wing in the Democratic Party. That no longer exists. It used to be that there were liberal Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans, John Lindsay, Jacob Javits. That no longer exists. When Susan Collins is the liberal part of the Republican Party, there is no liberal part of the Republican Party. I think the change in media has contributed to this. The country has always been divided, but I think the development of media in the 20th century created a national culture in a way that never existed before. People were watching the same movies, then listening to the same radio programs, then watching the same television programs, same news. Now we can just watch the news that fits our ideological profile, and so we don't have that unity coming about. I don't think we ever can really decrease the authority of the national government. We need it for national defense. We need it for basic civil rights. We need it for basic programs like Medicare and Social Security. So I think then what we're talking about is something much more around the margins of what might we leave to state and local governments without jeopardizing that, which almost all believe we need the national government to do.
Patrick over there. I think you can actually just speak. I think it's okay.
Oh, for the broadcast, he needs the mic.
Okay.
So I guess I'm curious a little bit more maybe about the symptoms of the problem that you sort of walked around, and maybe what I see as being an inability to sort of solve big problems on our political system anymore. I mean, we could choose any number of them. We're just looking outside. If we look at the sort of smoke-filled skies of California, I'm someone who believes in climate change. I'm also someone who is entirely open to any solution to it. I would accept a carbon tax if that's what Republicans want. I'd accept all nuclear power if that's what they want, but we're unable to have an honest conversation about real problems. And obviously we're unable to solve real problems because we can't even figure out if we all agree on them. I'm sort of curious about how you guys diagnose, like beyond sort of this conversation about conversations to actually starting to solve these really big issues.
So I think it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. And I think that was it Churchill who essentially said one thing about America is we'll do the right thing after we've tried the wrong thing in every conceivable way. So I don't see an immediate mechanism on the horizon to moderate our politics, to move us into a situation where intelligent dialogue, healthy political debates, healthy political compromise are the order of the day. I think if you look over the course of American history, we've had moments where that's the case, but I think dysfunction in politics has been a lot more common than we would like to think. But I would say this. Here's what I have been urging people as I speak on college campuses and I speak out in communities. Okay, can we at least agree on basic civil liberties? Can we at least circle the wagons around the Bill of Rights? Can we at least say, sort of a legal corollary to the Golden Rule, I will fight for the rights of others that I would like to exercise myself? And if we can at least build from a common defense of civil liberties, one of the things in my experience, because I have defended people on the left and the right, their rights to free speech and rights to free exercise of religion and their due process rights, that process of defending someone, of standing up for someone that you disagree with, actually bonds people. It actually creates a relationship. So that's a beginning idea. The other thing is, as far as a cultural change, we have to rediscover the very concept of tolerance. I don't think we even know what that is anymore. So, for example, if you're going to talk to somebody and you say, are you tolerant? And they might say, well, yeah, what's the evidence you're tolerant? Well, I'm accepting of people of every race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation. And one of the things I'd ask next is, what's wrong with those folks then? Well, nothing's wrong with them. Well, then what are you tolerating? Tolerance implies that there is something wrong that you have to tolerate. There is something wrong that you're going to either overlook or you're going to accept and value the other aspects of the person. And we're beginning to really lose that. We're going to be beginning to really lose that. And so I think from a legal point of view, I would really like to see a greater respect and bipartisan defense of fundamental civil liberties. From a cultural perspective, I would like to see a greater value placed on tolerating and respecting people for whom there is something that you have to tolerate.
I certainly agree in terms of embracing the basic fundamental rights under the Constitution. I disagree in terms of your definition of tolerance. I don't think you have to believe there's something wrong with somebody in order to tolerate them. I can simply say, your views are different than mine, but I believe you have the right to express them, and I'll tolerate it. I don't think there's some objective moral truth that makes me right and you wrong. I just think that the nature of society is that we have different views and we should be tolerant. It's not about right and wrong to me. I think your question goes to something much more fundamental. Does society have the capacity to deal with long-term cataclysmic problems that require international solutions? And I don't think we know the answer to that question, because the planet's never faced the kind of challenge that global warming presents to it and climate change presents to it now. And whether we can deal with that is going to just have phenomenal consequences for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren into the future. And unfortunately, right now, we have the worst possible president and head of EPA for dealing with the problem of climate change. The idea that we could have a president, head of EPA, who deny climate change as a problem, rather than deal with the problem of climate change, when the clock is really ticking on this.
Well, on one thing on climate change, I think there's
30 seconds.
Sure. What we have to understand is the climate changing? Yes, of course it is. But then when you have a measure that you want to deal with, what's the suggestion, what is the suggested solution? That always entails a cost-benefit analysis. It always entails a cost-benefit analysis. And where an awful lot of the disagreement now is on the cost-benefit analysis. I don't know, there are some Republicans who will deny climate change. But where I see a lot of the disagreement is where's the cost-benefit? How do we err on the cost-benefit analysis, especially when you also have to consider that in the developing world, we want hundreds of millions of people to be blessed with the kind of material prosperity that we're blessed with. And that involves the consumption and the production of energy at scale. And so those are things that are very complicated. And those are things that also involve human lives. Human lives are at stake in the ability to develop parts of the world that are underdeveloped. And so that's something that I often don't hear people wrestling with sufficiently.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop because that'll be the next topic of our next conversation. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you so much for giving us time to speak here. And I just want to say, as a student, the purpose of these conversations is to really inculcate hope within the student body across universities, and to really show that these conversations are possible. And a lot of people just don't see these types of responsible politics taking place. So thank you so much for responsible and constructive discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.